I think we're live. It's always so abrupt when that happens. But welcome back. My name is Michael Vaughn. I am here with Amy Testator, and we are here for our EdTech chat for August. Thanks for joining us here at Open LMS. We really appreciate your time this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you happen to be, whatever time zone you happen to be in. And today we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to Amy's heart, which is cognitive load theory. Amy, would you love to give us an overview of today?
I would. Welcome back, everybody. Michael and I are glad to launch into the second part of our EdTech Chat series for this year. We took July off. We hope many of you had some time off in that time span too. As Michael mentioned, we are going to be talking about cognitive load theory. But before I jump into that, I do want to just give a quick shout out. Michael and I missed last month. We took last month off because we were out attending two amazing conferences last month. First was the Mountain Moot at Carroll College in Helena, Montana. And I want to give a special shout out to Dan Case and Rachel Martin for hosting that conference. We've been longtime attendees, but what a great experience for us. It's one of those conferences that we go to every year and we learn so much. So keep Mountain Moot on your radar. And Michael, you were also at the Online Learning Innovation Summit. Is that right? Do you want to tell a little bit about how that was?
So I was hosted at Surrey Community College here in North Carolina. It was part of a summer professional development conference for the North Carolina Community College schools. So thanks so much to Kathy Davis and all of our partners who invited us to participate in that event. Love working with the North Carolina Community College schools. I had a chance to do a little presentation about AI and connect with some folks, spend some time learning from each other, and really great experience all around. And I will say, it was the best conference swag that we've gotten so far, because a lot of folks don't necessarily know this unless you live in North Carolina, but Surrey Community College is in Dobson, and it's part of the Yadkin River Valley, and this is the primary spot in North Carolina where there are vineyards. And so the conference swag was actually 2 bottles that were of wine that were created, fermented, I don't know what the proper term is for wine, but it was made by the students at Surrey Community College. They have a viticulture program, 2 of them, one for people who want to run vineyards, one for people who want to grow and make wine, grow grapes and make wine. And I will say it's going to be really hard to top that conference swag moving forward. I don't know, if we're going to go to an HR conference or something like that and get 2 bottles of wine, but it was a very nice experience being able to visit them and even spend some time looking through their program and learning a little bit more about how they do what they do.
I always love when we go to conferences and we have the opportunity to experience either conference swag or booths that showcase student work and student creation. I think that kind of plays in a little bit to today's topic as well. This concept of cognitive load and cognitive load theory. So cognitive load theory is a research-backed approach to course and training design, so kind of content curriculum design. And it focuses on how to make the best use of learners' working memory without overtaxing it. So when we're learning, our working memory is really what's kind of going in the background. And if we start to overload that, there's zero retention. And I know Michael and I we are so aware of this, because when we do training sessions, Michael and I can talk about, what we do in the open source software that we work with until to an empty room forever. We just really enjoy it. But we also are aware of the fact that sometimes we have to really scale back how much we're trying to talk about in a given time. Because we've both been in that situation where you've been in a session and there's so much content and you walk away and you think to yourself, I didn't learn a single thing in there. It was so packed with information. I have no idea what happened there. And when we talk about cognitive load, that's an example of when we've been overloaded. There's too high of a cognitive load and it actually prohibits learning. So cognitive load theory helps us to balance this concept of we need to make everything very resource intensive and content rich with what is the actual capacity of the brain to learn, and how do we maximize learning, keeping that in mind, that what that absolute load is for someone. So the cognitive load is the amount of information that your working memory can handle at any one time. So if you think about, different things that you've done and how, so I like to think about it in terms of YouTube. So I use YouTube a lot to figure out how to fix my house, but I often need to stop every couple minutes to give myself a minute to absorb what was just said, think about how I'm going to implement that, go ahead and do those steps, giving myself that opportunity to practice, to reinforce that learning, and then go forward onto the next step. So with something like YouTube, I'm able to do that. I'm able to pause the video to regulate how much information is coming in and how my working memory is processing that. But if I'm in a lecture, for example, or in a workshop, for example, I'm not in control as the learner. I'm not as in control of how all that plays out, whether or not I can pause things, and how much content is kind of coming into my brain at any given time. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about cognitive load.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we had some slides to share at some point just to go into the overall structure of how that can work. But this is one of those things that I've really paid attention to for a long while. Ever since I think it was all the way going back to 2010, 2011. At my another job at the time, I had put together this workshop about how to design really effective presentations. And it was a 6-hour long workshop. And the university I was working at the time had an agreement with the faculty that if professional development was 4 hours or longer, we would feed them. And then my department said, this is getting really expensive. So it became a 3-hour workshop. But been talking about cognitive load theory for a long while, especially within the context of presentations, going back to what you were saying, Amy, because you're right. One of the things that we talk about a lot with, andragogy, just adult learning theories, is one of the things adult learners want is a bit of autonomy and control over how they are learning. And you don't always have that in live environments. And we're also in a spot where we're trying to balance what learners need with also the needs of an instructor. And very often the needs of an instructor are they might feel uncomfortable talking in front of groups, someone who's trying to share information. Public speaking is still one of the largest fears of Americans, as an example, not to be ethnocentric here, but I think it's like still the second or third place fear. And when you have folks who are afraid to speak in front of others, what are they going to do? They're going to do anything possible to make sure that they feel a little bit more comfortable. And that usually means putting an awful lot of text, an awful lot of information on slides, because if it's all up there, then you can't mess anything up, right? You can't miss anything. But ironically, that ends up hurting the learning way more than anything else. By the way, if you want me to switch through any of these slides, you just let me know. I can jump ahead to some other ones.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, we are always, for my teaching days, I was always concerned that there would be something that I missed. And there are times still when I'll walk out of a session, I'll say to Michael, I forgot to talk about this thing. And that was like so important. And, but it happens. And I think that we're always trying to straddle that line between making sure we give people lots of information, but also not giving them, not saturating people and giving them more information than they need. And as we think about how we can actually employ cognitive load theory in our build and in our courses and our design, our instructional design, curriculum design, and what those elements look like, you'll start to see that if you follow these different key aspects that we're going to talk about here as we come into the slide deck, you'll still end up with a very content rich, but very targeted and adaptable curriculum and content that you can change based off of the baseline expertise of your learners, their different needs, and making things differentiated in a very easy way. So I think that's kind of, those are all things that when we bring them all together, we actually end up with a better program, better content, better delivery than we did when we were trying to just put all of the information we could think of onto slides. And I've definitely been in courses where, you go into a lecture and there's a 300 slide PowerPoint deck. Can't tell you a single thing that was on those slides. There's too much information there. All right, Michael, do you want to go ahead to the next slide and we will talk a little bit about what this is? So when we talk about how people process information, this is how they process it, right? So the information comes in, it comes into their sensory memory, and then it goes into that working memory. So as we sit and we listen to what's being said, initially our sensory memory picks it up, we're hearing it, we're seeing it. Our working memory begins to process it. And so we either can, in the working memory stage, this is where we want to offer rehearsal. So we want to offer people that opportunity to hear the information more than once in different ways, practice what they're learning. So if I've given a concept that can be applied, I'm going to give them an immediate opportunity to practice it. And that's how we commit things to long-term memory. If we don't capture people's sensory memory and we overload their working memory and don't give that chance for rehearsal, things don't get committed to long-term memory. They're just forgotten. And if you think about this in terms of your everyday life, you're walking through your everyday life. It's very busy. You're barraged with all kinds of things that you need to do. You walk into a room and you can't remember why you're there. That information never made it past your overloaded working memory. And you're now
I
standing in
hate
the middle
I
of
hate
your
when that
kitchen,
happens.
like, why am I here? Yeah. So, we often frame these things in terms of what happens in the classroom, but when we think about our everyday life, we can totally see what happens when our brain gets overloaded. And I am so guilty of standing in the middle of a room, not remembering why I'm there. But there are other things that are so oddly committed to my long-term memory. We joke about this all the time. There was this bug in the software that we use. It was like many versions ago. I always refer to it as my favorite software bug for reasons even I don't understand. I remember every detail of this bug that has literally no impact on my life now because it's been fixed for many, many years. But I honestly can't tell you if I ate breakfast or switched the clothes from the washer to the dryer. And that's because when I was learning about that bug, I had the opportunity to really process it with my working memory and work on problems related to it and investigate it. It was committed to my long-term memory. When I'm putting my laundry in, I have 1,000 other things I'm thinking about, and I don't remember that that's happened. And so that's a good example of how we can think about what we do in the classroom in the context of what that kind of looks like in our everyday life as well. So this is basically, when we process information, this is how it happens in our brain and how it ends up in our long-term memory.
Yeah. And one thing that's really easy to overlook in this chart because we didn't explicitly label it, is that the brain is always trying to prioritize information and it doesn't always get it right. Because the brain knows it doesn't always know what is actually important, or if your brain is in the process of learning new information, it doesn't know what is or is not important. And this is one of those downfalls of cognitive load and exceeding the limits of what your learners are currently capable of. In terms of processing information live and in real time, because that step from working memory to long term memory is so fascinating. One example that I would love to give in the presentation design training is I would ask the group just 2 questions. And the first question, I was usually working with groups of college or university students. So this was usually in a classroom. And I would say, okay, where is the nearest bathroom? And one time I did this and they all pointed at the door because directly across from the door that's where the restrooms were. And it made sense that they had committed that to memory, right? Their brain had prioritized that information. Their brain said, that is important for me to know because this body needs to go to the bathroom multiple times a day. It's really helpful to know where the most important one is. And when we talk about, exposing people to new information, helping them understand that this is something that you need to prioritize so that you're not ignoring it, and giving them that rehearsal step practice where they can try it over and over again. The second question that I asked them is, where is the closest fire extinguisher? And no one knew, because when's the last time anyone had to put out a fire, right? It makes sense that you would know where the bathroom is. It doesn't make as much sense that you would know where the fire extinguisher was. But in this case, the fire extinguisher was literally right next to the door of the classroom where they had been the entire semester. It's still one of my favorite things to have happened in a live environment. But I think it goes back to just what we're talking about in this model where, let me go ahead and make sure that that's pulled back up. In this model where, it's not always called out as specifically, but the brain is constantly trying to prioritize and figure out what is important. And when we're overloading them, what's going to happen is their brain's going to do a really bad job of that, right? They're not going to know what to prioritize because they're learning something new. So it's something really easy to miss in this chart, but something that I definitely wanted to call out because that step from input to working memory to long-term memory is a very fragile process. And it moves very quickly, and without a lot of guidance and support to make sure that that is a really streamlined, efficient process that's supportive of learners, you do end up missing an awful lot. Like everything goes into that forgotten bin down there.
Absolutely. Michael, let's check out the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about As Michael mentioned, he asked his students two questions at the beginning of the course, right? At the beginning of the class. Where's the bathroom? Where's the fire extinguisher? So this isn't a basic needs assessment. This is where Michael kind of gauges we call it your level of expertise. But sometimes our level of expertise is based off of what our brain prioritizes. So sometimes we'll say, oh, this person is an expert about this thing. Just so happens their brain also helped to prioritize that type of information, and they just retained a lot of it. And so some of the expertise that we see in our learners is based off of what their brain has prioritized in terms of what it thinks is the most important information. But in order for us to really effectively teach students and help learners and make sure that our training is effective, we need to understand what that expertise is as a baseline. Where are our learners starting? And then we need to adapt our presentations and our courses and our content accordingly. So the first thing we do is kind of perform a needs assessment. Michael's was a very basic needs assessment. Where is the bathroom? That's a need. People need to know where the bathroom is. So if people didn't know, it was a great opportunity for Michael to change trajectory. In his experience, he knows most of the time they're going to know where the bathroom is, but not know where the fire extinguisher is. But if it came to pass that they didn't know where the bathroom was, it's a great opportunity to change direction and talk about that. And that's what we do when we're performing that needs assessment. There's a purpose behind that. And it's so that we can gauge that familiarity, the base comfort, baseline knowledge, and people's comfort with the topics we're going to talk about. From there, we can begin with that assessment, that needs assessment, and use that to drive the direction we're going in. We often come into our teaching and training with an idea of where we're going to begin. We've mapped out exactly how things are going to go. Michael and I can tell you from many years of doing training, we do a training consult with people ahead of time. So we have a good idea of exactly what content we're going to cover. I would say 75% of time we get into a session and some of the questions that arise have us immediately change direction, because what we assumed to be the baseline and we thought was the baseline isn't necessarily the baseline. That's actually why we started doing training consultation, was so we could really gauge what that baseline is, and we can adapt either way. Once you've done that needs assessment and you kind of understand what people's level of comfort is with the topic, public speaking, great example. People have a low level of comfort with public speaking. When people have a low level of comfort with a topic or an action, their baseline familiarity and expertise will be lower. Not necessarily because they haven't been exposed to that content, but fear can preclude our ability to retain information and commit it to working memory and then rationalize how to complete those tasks. So identifying all of these things can help us direct how we're going to present content, build content. Typically, once I get to this point, I start to leverage Bloom's taxonomy a little bit. While I'm not someone who uses Bloom's to inform everything, I do like to think about some of the terminology in there, and use that to frame my learning objectives, what my outcomes are going to be. Often we can't change outcomes, but we can move around with our learning objectives. But we can leverage Bloom's or another model to help us build experiences that are more closely targeted to what the baseline expertise is that our learners have. And that's going to change, but we have to be willing to adapt our teaching to start where our learners are and build from there. Because if we start in a place that's really high above or really below where they are, we've already lost them and we're not going to get to where we need to get to at the end. Which is kind of what brings us to our next topic, which is going to be how do we reduce the problem space, which is the space between where we begin and where we need to get to.
Yeah, and there was one thing that I was thinking of while you were sharing that, which is we run into this curse of expertise a lot when we work with folks, and it just requires that constant retooling of what we're going to do. And it's ironic because cognitive load, it interplays so nicely with so many other learning concepts and theories and neuroscientific principles, where, if you think about something like an acronym is a really effective way to compartmentalize and efficiently ship information. But if you don't know what that acronym means, if you don't have a context for that, then I'm actually creating more load for you by using an acronym, because now you're trying to decipher what that means in your brain, while also trying to balance everything else that I'm giving you at the same time. So it's really interesting that, like, when you're trying to help learners, sometimes you still have to catch yourself with that curse of expertise and keep dialing back and dialing it back and dialing it back to make sure that you're actually meeting them where they are, right? Every once in a while, we'll work with someone who's brand new to working with an LMS, and we might not even explain what LMS stands for because A, it might not be that important in the moment, but B, they also might not care, and we're trying to figure out what is most important for you to learn in this moment. So it's just one of those things that I was thinking about while you were going through that list here. All right, so
Absolutely.
attention split.
Yeah. Well, I have these out of order. We're going to talk for a second. I don't know if I have the slide in there. I don't. I forgot it. But what I'm going to talk about, go back. If you can just go back to there you go. I've got Michael running the controls today. I'm in a hotel on a single screen. So, Michael's
it's like
running
a
those
curse
controls.
not having all that extra workspace. Yeah.
It is. And like to not have dual monitors is crazy. But one of the things here about measuring that expertise and adapting, as I mentioned, is reducing the problem space. The problem space is that gap between the current situation and the desired goal. So if the current situation is that we have someone who doesn't know what LMS means, they're brand new to this, they were voluntold that this is their job, sometimes that's the case, or it's a new direction in their career path and they're just really trying to get a handle on all the things and learn things. And our desired situation is that they are a fully functioning admin for their site. We have a pretty large problem space in there, but your problem space could be very small. So for example, Michael and I often get brought into conversations that have to do with like marketing and how would we like to market different things we do. And I'm not familiar with marketing jargon. So the problem space is for me learning the jargon. And for other people, it may be learning more about how to market yourself. So understanding what that gap is between where you are currently and where you're trying to get, that's your problem space. And one of the things we need to do to reduce that cognitive load is reduce that problem space, which is exactly what Michael's talking about when he talks about if you understand where people begin, then you can reduce the problem space by setting up small incremental goals for people. When people are brand new to something, we will often break their training down into very small sessions, 1-hour sessions. And at the end of each session, we have kind of goals that we've created. So what we try to do is we think about how do we load people up with information without overloading them? And how do we make sure that they have an opportunity again to practice things if we have a really big problem space or a really small one? And the best way we can kind of explain this is where your concept of chunking comes in. When it comes to breaking down the content to get from one spot to another, chunking content into small digestible content bits or blocks of time with an immediate opportunity to practice or apply that information after or during is how we reduce that problem space. It's how we move people more quickly from one spot to another. So a good way to think about this is if you told me today that on Friday I needed to be a functioning proficient electrician, and I don't know really anything. I took one class in high school 100 million years ago about electricity. I know very
installed a
little.
ceiling fan once. That was
right?
we're in
Yeah,
trouble.
I can put a wire knot on, and I know turn the power off of the breaker box. Those are my two things I know. But if you said I needed to get from here to there in a very short period of time, that's an impossible feat if you just start pouring information at me. But if we set up small goals and we said, okay, between now and Friday, you need to be able to remove an existing receptacle and put a new one in, and that's the skill we're going to focus on this week, then by Friday, I will likely be able to do that. And then if next week we go into something else and we chunk things into smaller bits, I'm more likely to become proficient in something that way, rather than if you just tried to give me all of the information an electrician would need to know between now and my endpoint. So when we think about closing that gap, reducing that problem space, all about chunking, breaking things up small, making sure that we're giving people lots of opportunity to practice.
Yeah, and I will say first and foremost that in education, it feels like we are very bad at branding things. So it's like, hey, here's one of the most effective things you can do for learning. It's called chunking. It just sounds so unappealing. But the story that I used to share with folks is that several years ago, I weighed over 300 pounds. I was having a lot of health issues, so I had opted to work with a nutritionist, and she, for whatever reason, kept trying to fight the losing battle of getting me to eat kale. And she'd be like, you should really try kale. It's good for your liver. I'm like, I really don't care if it's good for my liver or not. I don't like kale. It's earthy. It's bitter. Like, I'm just not a fan. And then eventually she tried a new approach with me. She came back and she said, I have a lot of clients who have children, which was her constructive way of saying, you, Michael, are being a child. And she gave me this recipe where I take the kale, I chop it up into little pieces with a food processor, and then I work it into a recipe that I'm already familiar with, like a turkey meatloaf or something like that. And it's so interesting to me that like you can pull all these different lessons from your day-to-day life to help people understand how different concepts work, that like very often when you try to give new information to learners, you can work into something that they're already familiar with. And it's just that process of chunking and filtering and finding new strategies and structures that make things more memorable. I know a lot of us probably had to take a foreign language in high school years ago, and they probably had a song or two for like verb conjugations and words and things like that. And those are all just simple ways to chunk content, right? To put them into meaningful structures so that they are a little bit easier to hang on to and work with. And it's one of those strategies that I absolutely love because it's so poorly named, but it's so effective at helping with cognitive load down the road. I think the last example I would give is if you work at a college or university, the chunking strategies that Amy's talking about, one really good example is how you give out your office phone number to people, because phone numbers are actually 10 consecutive digits and they're usually all different. That's really hard for someone to remember. That's a lot to hang on to, not just in your working memory, which will last about 30 seconds or so, and hope that makes it into long-term memory. Like it's a lot to put on someone in a moment. So what do? You probably don't need an area code, right? I have yet to see a college or university where they have different area codes for the college or university. It's just the same area code every time. So you've already cut 3 digits out. And just about every school that I've worked at has the same 3 digits at the start of the phone number. So usually when people are on campus giving their number to other people who are on campus, they just give the last 4 digits of the phone number. So this is an example of chunking because that they already have that pre-existing information. They can just kind of slot it back in later. And now you have this really efficient way to give someone something complicated in a way that avoids overloading them. It's just, I love this theory. We could talk about this forever. This could be like 3 or 4 sessions because it ties so nicely into all these other things that we talk about. But I will try not to hold us up too much. Did you want to move on to that reducing attention splits?
Yeah, let's talk about that one.
Okay. Yeah. I'll dial myself back.
We should do one that's solely about how do we reduce the problem area or the gap in knowledge using chunking. I think it's a super effective way to do things. I agree. Terrible name. And I definitely think we should share some memes about kale, because there's a hilarious one that says like, what's the secret to being healthy? And then it's like, it's kale, isn't it? Please tell me it's not kale. And I laugh every time I see it. So, there's this fascinating concept that threads through education right now, which is that we should just pepper people with information from every possible angle because we think that particularly younger students are so used to being exposed to information coming from a variety of angles. But what they're actually most accustomed to is bite-sized bits of information coming in, but not all at the same time, right? So this idea that we're processing all the information at the same time is actually a misconception. So when we talk about reducing attention split, we are going to still provide multiple inputs for information, but we're going to make them sequential, right? So we're not going to be, look at this graphic and then bring this up on your phone and answer this Kahoot, but watch my PowerPoint slide at the same time. That's not super effective. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we provide input to a learner, we are giving them all of the information they need in that single input. Earlier, Michael displayed a graphic that showed how we learn, how we process information, and each of the blocks and each of the steps was labeled directly on it. That is a great example of how we've actually reduced attention split. Had we instead put a number value next to each one of those items and put a legend below that explained, like, number 1 is input, and number 2 is sensory memory, and number 3 is working memory, that would be a less effective visual learning graphic, because a learner's attention is being split between the graphic and the legend, and then trying to make the connection about the information being presented. So when we reduce attention split, what we're trying to do is whatever input we're giving the student, so output from us, input for them, we're making sure that it contains exactly what they need to know all in one spot. So they're not having to look at a legend or reference something in another book to understand what we're giving them. It's all presented to them. We can still say, we're going to go through this slide, then we're going to practice something in, the LMS. We have an activity in there, and then we're going to go over this graphic. We can still do that and have different inputs that come sequentially as opposed to all at once. So basically, we want to make sure that whatever we're putting in for information, we're making sure that it is all inclusive of what the learner needs to have. So we're labeling those figures, making sure that we have full descriptions attached or directly in conjunction with an image. If you are doing images for the sake of accessibility, you obviously need an alternative text description of an image. But if your image is something that is very descriptive, has a lot of information, there would be a lot you would get from it. That alt text isn't going to convey what's happening in that image. So one of the things Michael and I do is we often provide a transcript of the image, so a full image description. So if I didn't even see the image, I'd still know what was being presented. This is really helpful. We like to put that stuff using an H5P accordion activity directly below the image, so it's actually all together. But making sure that we have things kind of clustered together. People aren't having to go to various places to see that information. One input at a time, and we make that inclusive of the information we're trying to present. And then, we want to keep things together and concise, but we also don't want to have every image or every figure we're trying to explain all on one page. Like, do one thing at a time, and then give people the opportunity to either reinforce that, ask questions, process it for a minute before we move on, before we give them more information. Sometimes we'll have graphics or images or figures where we're building. So we start small, then we build upon a concept and build upon that concept. We want to do those sequentially, but offer an opportunity for processing in between.
Yeah, and I feel like there are a lot of good ways to do that already, that you can take advantage of to really help reduce this attention split. I know one of my favorites is I love using the book resource to consolidate related materials into one spot. And what I love about it is it provides structure for the learners, because they've got that table of contents and they know that this is a self-contained type of unit. And it gives me a chance to break up that content in a meaningful way so that I'm not overloading them too much. So I'm not giving them everything all at once. I can break it up into pieces, but those pieces are still part of this cohesive whole of the book. And it's not just the book resource. I mean, you can use the interactive book in H5P. I think about like interactive video as an example. I think about those common module settings and release criteria that you can add, not just to individual activities and resources, but to entire sections of a course. So the learners have to meet certain goals before the next content is released. That way, you know that they're prepared to move forward. So it's just, yeah, there are a lot of great ways to do this that are already built in, which is really exciting. So it actually does not require a tremendous lift on the part of the instructor to do a lot of these things. It's really just what tools do you choose to use and how do you choose to format the existing content?
I agree. And one thing, kind of the next thing we'll talk about is plays into reducing attention split, but it's actually one of the most interesting parts of cognitive load theory and the learning science behind it, which is that if you complement visuals with an auditory piece, it actually reduces the load on working memory, which I find absolutely fascinating. You would think it would be the opposite, but it's actually not. So one of the things when we talk about reducing the multiple visual inputs that we can do instead of having a number of different visuals is we can actually complement a visual with an auditory component accompaniment. That could be something that completely explains, so it goes step by step through what we're looking at on that figure or that graphic. Or it could be that something that's supplementary, so adds to. So it could be that, people are looking at it and then we're kind of expanding or expounding upon what's already in that graphic. Adding an auditory track to a visual dramatically increases the chance that what's in that visual will be committed to long-term memory, because having the dual input and that auditory explanation helps to reduce the load on working memory. So it gives people the opportunity to fully commit. We're stimulating different parts of the sensory memory there, but in a way that's not overloading people. So it's not a variety of different things coming in at once. It's one thing, everything's contextual. And, worst case, you can actually even just add light music behind things. So if people are going through, Michael mentioned the book activity, also one of my very favorites. But if I had a collection of different graphics that we were going to move through, I could put some light classical music or something like that in the background. Many, many, many studies have shown that playing a light music in the background while you're trying to study or while you're reading actually improves your attention span, but it also improves your the amount, so it increases the amount of information that is committed to your long-term memory. So that's something that's been studied forever and ever and ever. And the neuroscience behind that is absolutely fascinating. But when we talk about cognitive load theory, one of the major components of how we can reduce cognitive load and increase long-term retention is to make sure that we're accompanying visuals with some auditory component. Like Michael and I talk about frequently, when it comes to anything that's like audio related, the quality of your audio matters more than almost anything else.
Mhm.
So making sure that you have a nice rich audio with not a lot of background noise. You don't sound like you're in a tin can. Things are you're drawing attention where you need to draw attention based off the intonation in your voice. You are articulating and enunciating well. These things are all important. So when you do add an auditory track, you just want to make sure that you are you have a good quality recording, and you can do this. We talk about this often. I have a very inexpensive headset that actually is just honestly held together by tape at this point because I've had it for so long, but it was something like $25, and the audio is pretty decent for that price. But if you are going to record audio to go with something, just make sure that it's a good quality track. Listen to it before you publish it. A high quality track, a track that's, doesn't have a lot of distractions in the background, can even compensate for a little bit of blurriness on a graphic, or, if a graphic looks kind of boring, you can't make them all look wonderful and exciting. It does help to compensate for that, but it really does enhance the learning experience for people when they have that audio accompaniment with something. It's also a way to differentiate what you're presenting. So we talk about offering differentiated instruction, which is content offered in multiple modalities based on how a learner is suited to engage with that. So sometimes there are certain things that I like to see, but other times there are certain things that I do better when I'm hearing them and I can hear the steps. When we differentiate that content and we offer multiple ways for someone to digest it, it just gives them an opportunity on any given day to access the content in different ways and commit it to their memory.
And this is one of those things that I love talking about within the context of PowerPoint slides and slides in general, in presentations is, you're absolutely right. It's the audio that supports the visual, and it just works so well to form much stronger memories that are much easier to recall at a later date. And what ends up happening in a lot of presentations is, again, we see a lot of text put onto slides, and that is really, really overwhelming for learners. That is the easiest way to violate the limits of their cognitive load, is to put too much text on slides. And the explanation for this is always something that makes me laugh a little bit, but it comes down to the slightly uncomfortable fact that there is a voice in our head that reads to us when we read, right? That voice is like our voice, but it's not quite our voice. It takes a breath even though it doesn't need to. It can't shout. It can only ever talk at one volume. So even if it like tries to shout, it's really just at the same volume. Like, you're not going to wince when your internal voice shouts. And that's really important because One thing that comes up in neuroscience a lot is the idea of multitasking, right? We talk a lot about multitasking. You see plenty of articles about students. Oh, they're multitasking all the time. And, they're not very good at it. And the reason they're not very good at it is because multitasking, by and large, is not a really sound concept. Most of the time, what people are doing when they think they're multitasking is task switching, just going from thing to thing to thing. And when you have to stop and switch and start doing this thing, even if your brain does that in just a couple milliseconds, which it sometimes can do, you have to completely retool mentally what you are doing. And then the efficiency drops quite a bit. That's why we talk about, uninterrupted time at work when you're trying to work on a project. Because if someone interrupts you, it can take upwards of 20 to 30 minutes to get back on track with what you were doing. So when you put too much text on slides, what's happening is, from a multitasking perspective, you are asking your learners to do something that they are very, very bad at, which is follow two concurrent conversations at the exact same time. For those of you on the call who have more than one child or who babysat a lot in the past, and you've had two kids try and talk to you at the same time, it works so poorly. It is immediately overwhelming because our brains cannot handle that. It's just too much input. It is too overwhelming. So when we put a lot of text on slides in live instructional scenarios, what's happening is we are the speaker. We are the audio, right? We as the instructors are the audio as we are talking. But there is also another speaker in the room in the minds of our learners that is reading all that text to them. And so that means that two people are talking. This is why you overload students so easily when you put too much text on slides, is because you're now asking them to listen to two people at once. Again, a little uncomfortable to think about because that voice in our head is a little odd the longer you really kind of dissect it a little bit. But that's essentially what's going on. I find that to be really, really fascinating because, what Amy's saying is true. When you have audio accompaniment to visual input, what happens is you form a much stronger memory, right? Images are very, very powerful things. They're literally worth 1,000 words. And the reason for that is about half of our brain, directly or indirectly, is devoted to processing visual information. We're so good at it because we do it frequently. Assuming we are a sighted individual, we process visual information constantly and very, very quickly. And so we're really good at that part. So when you have the audio narration to contextualize some of the things that you're looking at, what it does is it just makes that memory more powerful. Okay, I'm gonna dial myself back again because I'm getting excited. I can tell. I'm gonna roll it back a little bit. I think we were looking at another slide coming up here about busy work. Do you want to switch over to that one?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
All right. Otherwise, I'm going to talk about presentations all day long.
All day
It's one
long.
of my favorite topics.
So, the last thing to know about employing cognitive load theory is that, in addition to making sure that we understand where our learners are and we're meeting them where they are and building from there, so scaffolding and chunking, and we're reducing all of these different inputs so that we have things that are contextual and that we can focus on, and adding, auditory accompaniments to things to kind of capitalize on that. The other thing we need to do is cut out the busy work. When we are teaching hybrid or online courses, busy work becomes extremely problematic, even more so, I think, than when we're in a face-to-face classroom, because we're often trying to recreate and make sure that there's so much contact time with content that it equates to the same amount of contact time as if we're in a classroom. So we create busy work, and busy work is just work that we create for the sake of having work. It reminds me of meetings for the sake of meeting, things where we didn't need to meet. It could have been an email. Busy work is very similar. It doesn't need to be in your course. People could go out and do those things on their own if they wanted to. Busy work typically is not objective and outcome driven. So we think it may be, but in the end, completing that work, that busy work, doesn't actually help someone achieve an outcome, and it doesn't relate to one of your learning objectives. So when we were looking at reducing cognitive load, we want to make sure that all of the experiences, all of the learning experiences that we're building are meaningful and purposeful. They're all linked to an outcome and an objective. So there's a purpose behind them, a why and a how, and it all links to an outcome that we can measure at the end. Anything else that doesn't lead us to get from point A to point B in a way that we can measure is just considered busy work, and we don't want that in there. Busy work drastically increases the cognitive load on people and thereby decreases their retention of what we want them to learn and what we need them to remember. And it results in poor outcomes. So people not meeting our outcomes. It's not objective driven. We can't really measure it. It also means that we've created busy work for ourselves. So when we're doing this and we're looking for activities for the sake of activity or to have more hours measured in the course, we're actually setting our own selves up for failure, because now we have to come up with all of these other activities and all of these other items. When in actuality, if we just offered more opportunity for practice of the things that we need people to learn, that is actually outcome driven and that is measurable, and that counts as that contact time. So when we are building no busy work, it needs to be a no. I wish I had Michael's slide of the person shouting no with the spray bottle. For any time you think about busy work, that's a no. Instead, make sure those learning activities have an objective. Every learning activity needs to link to an objective. It links to an outcome. It when completing it, a student is actually getting to a point where they're able to demonstrate something measurable. And that's what we should have from all of our activities, even if the activity is something that's like a reinforcing activity. So just giving, there it is. Anytime busy work happens, here's what you need to keep in mind. No with the spray bottle. So what we want people to do is build learning activities and opportunities for students. So whether that's collaborative or it's a practice reinforcement of something, if we're offering them practice to reinforce a concept, we also want to be in and evaluate that so we can see perhaps where our gaps may continue to be, so we can offer some supplemental instruction. So everything we do needs to be meaningful and purposeful and link back to something. You can think about this in terms of chores at your house. So when I was younger, we used to have chores we had to do. And at the time, I didn't really see the purpose in all of them. But as an adult, I do see the purpose in them. So doing these small incremental things over the course of the week meant that I didn't have to spend a whole Saturday inside. The house looked clean, that was measurable. So we can think about it in terms of that. There are other things that aren't super, that could be chores that we give to our kids that are truly just busy work to kind of keep them occupied. And when we're talking about learning, we don't want to just keep people occupied. We want to keep them engaged. And that's the big difference here in cutting out our busy work.
Yeah, you're reminding one of our kids did not want to clean up, and then she tripped and fell over one of her toys and hurt herself. Thankfully, it was just like a kiss boo boo type of hurt herself, so not like urgent care or anything like that. But it's really hard in that moment because you want to reassure them a bit, but also you want to immediately tie back the lesson to be like, when we talk about picking up, it's not just because we're done playing, it's because it's a safety issue, right?
Exactly.
We deserve a clean space, we deserve a safe space. So it's one of those things that I think about a lot. I feel like there was some graphic that you had made a little while back that it made me think of. I think it was about like what adult learners are looking for in learning environments, and one of those things is that sense of purpose, right? Like, how does this tie into what I'm doing or what I want to do? Where is the personal connection here for me? And I think it touches on one of the easily overlooked things with cognitive load, which is, no one is perfect. No instructor is perfect. Like, we're going to do our best to try and minimize the chances of us accidentally overwhelming a learner, but it will still happen from time to time. So what are some resiliency strategies for them? And a really big, powerful one is motivation, right? If we're already building in situations where they trust that we're not going to ask them to do something that's not meaningful or that's just to fill time, and they know that the work that they're doing has purpose and ties into their own personal goals and values and the things that they want to accomplish, that usually does help overcome a little bit of that situation where, when we don't bat 1,000, it just gives them a little bit more motivation to loop back and back and back until they can work through something, which I find to be really fascinating. Again, I love this theory because it just ties into so many other things. It's really a linchpin in a lot of ways for when we talk about how learning can work in a wide variety of circumstances, and just so many different strategies that we can use to help streamline things here.
Absolutely, and it does. It ties right back into adult learning theory, and part of adult learning theory is, it's the Joe Pesci "Don't waste my time," right? Like, don't waste my time. There are some other words in there. I won't say them here, but the point being that when we are talking about cognitive load or adult learning theory, it is important to not waste people's time, to not take up their time for the sake of taking it up. So this is where that meaningful activities come in. The graphic Michael's talking about is that when we're teaching adult learners, we need to be aware of the amount of time that they have, make the best use of that time, but also make sure that what we're teaching them has purpose and meaning. People need to feel like there's a reason for them to be here and learning this. And you know that when you have learners who just don't see the purpose and behind what you're putting out there, they are very difficult to capture. So giving them some activities that put things into context for them so that they understand the actual real world application of what we're teaching them is really important. And this is where we move away from busy work and move into that meaningful and purposeful learning activity. We're giving them an opportunity to see this in a real world context within the context of their own jobs. So for example, we have a learning module we have to do here every single year. It's part of our annual compliance training, and it's all about office safety. But it was written for if you're in an actual office. So every year we really struggle with this one because it asks things like, where's the tornado shelter in your office? And I'm like, I guess that would be my basement, but like Michael doesn't have a basement, so his is the bathtub. It's
Safely lifting a 40-pound box of printer paper,
Yeah, exactly. Things that don't apply to us where we are. That learning for us tends to be busy work because it doesn't apply to us. We can't really find the purpose in our own everyday life because we're not working in a physical corporate office anymore. We're working in a home office. Now, to their credit, there have been new courses that have come out about home office safety and things like, making sure that things are ergonomically correct, making sure that your home office is free of safety hazards as well. So thankfully, as we have become a company that's hybrid, meaning that some people globally work in an actual office setting and most of us work from home, that learning has become more targeted to where our baseline is, what our actual situation is. But that first 2 years of doing what would happen if you worked in a corporate office was pretty hilarious. Trying to think of like who would you report an electrical hazard to, things like that. I didn't even remember. It's been so long since I've been in an actual office, but it's a good example of when something becomes busy work versus that purposeful learning activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're getting a little bit closer to one. I think the one thing that we hadn't touched on just yet that I wanted to share was the idea of always considering the medium that you're using to communicate with your learners. And that medium is going to have limitations and it's going to have strengths. And the consideration of what it is capable of is very important when you're thinking about what does cognitive load look like. I know I've been talking about this a lot in terms of presentations because lecture is a very common in-person teaching strategy, and it happens a lot in online environments too, where there are sometimes pre-recorded lectures or just slides that are posted and then gone over live in a webinar scenario. And to stick with that as an example, here, let me give you an example. I sat through a webinar a few years ago from a large industry trade organization called EdTech, and they always do these really interesting surveys, and I'm always very interested in what they've uncovered and what they've learned. But the way the data was presented in the webinar made it difficult to process because the medium didn't match up with how the information was being used. So this was an example of one of the charts. I have no expectation that anyone watching this be able to read this because the point is it's very difficult to read. This would be fantastic for a handout. This would be fantastic for a page resource or within a book resource in the LMS. where you have a little bit more time to dig in and read it more like you would read a book or read an article, right? But in a webinar presentation situation, it made it really hard to see the information here. And again, it just comes down to what's most effective for the medium that's being used. So usually what I will encourage folks to do is, if you're using a really visual medium, like a presentation or a video or something like that, the goal is really to tell the story, like to give the highlights rather than putting all of the information available in there. Information's really good for text, right? It's really good for articles. It's not so good when you're trying to visually communicate information maybe in a relatively short period of time. And one example I love to give is, this is a chart of adult populations that have a BMI of 30 or higher. So in other words, what percentage of the adult population in these countries would be classified as obese? And that's really important from a health standpoint, right? Like that can be tied to heart disease, diabetes, a lot of complications, life expectancy. And there are quite a few countries on this graph. This would be great for a handout. This would be great within an LMS, but it would be really terrible for a video or for a live presentation, because there's just too much information. It's very overwhelming for the learners. And really what's most important is that there be a story that's told that contextualizes what the point of this information actually is. So in a presentation scenario, what I would do is I would cut out as much as possible, like Amy was saying earlier. I would probably pick like 2 countries that are really known for healthy lifestyles, or they have like a reputation for, their citizens tend to live a really long time. They tend to live really healthy lifestyles. So I'll pick, Japan and Sweden. I'll pick a regional neighbor in Canada, and then the chart becomes this, which is actually readable. Like you can actually read this chart. And then you can see that there's a very big difference, right? So this would be a good lead in to say, hey, there might be a public health crisis to address, which is really the story behind all of that data on the previous slide. That's completely lost because we're overwhelming people with that. So sometimes really essential messages can be lost because of this cognitive overload, because we are misusing the mediums that we're trying to connect with. And if I even put those side by side, like this is a quarter of the original size. The original table's not readable anymore, and the one that's down to a quarter of its original size is still relatively legible. So it's just one of those things where when you're building content, it's really important to think about, how am I presenting this to learners, and what do they need, and what is this medium going to be really good at, and where is it going to struggle? Because the tools that we have available do define some of the approaches that we take from time to time, and it's really important to consider, how do I not overload folks when I'm using those particular tools?
Great points. Yeah, and data visualizations are an excellent example of how we often overload people with information to the point that the information is then not meaningful to them. They aren't able to digest it. It's not usable. It's not actionable because too much has been presented. So it needs to be definitely presented in a way that makes it actionable for people, that makes it so that they can actually visualize it. That's the point of a data visualization, right? So that when I look at it, I derive some meaning from what I'm seeing, versus seeing every country in the world next to each other really doesn't. I mean, you can see that the US is above others, but it doesn't really paint that picture of what that range looks like, what that comparison looks like. And that's what we're trying to drive from that visualization.
Yeah. In our last 90 seconds or so, I know it was really important to us to share that the location has been formally announced for our Connected 2024 conference. We would absolutely love for you all to be a part of that as presenters, as attendees. This was a great chance for us to get together and meet with everyone. This year we met in Arizona a little bit earlier this year. We thought it was going to be really nice and sunny. It turned out to be cold and rainy the entire time. I was like, this is the opposite of Arizona weather I expected, but it was a great time to connect with everyone. And it's a really nice collegial, informal conference. We have multiple tracks that have already been announced. So please do consider joining us for that conference. We're currently accepting proposals. So if you had wanted to present, please do consider that. We are going to be meeting up in Charlotte, North Carolina in late February this year. And I want to point out, 2024 is a leap year, so part of the conference will be on leap day, which is, I think, makes the conference even better. So if you've never had cheer wine, please come to this conference. We will make sure that you have a chance to try that and Biscuitville while you're in town. We'll make sure that you get all the good food and all the good drinks. We're very, very overly obsessed with barbecue here, so we will also make sure that you get some good barbecue.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this. It's always great to connect with people in the EdTech and then teaching and learning education industries. Just to note, this conference is open to everyone. So whether you are a client of Open LMS or not, we would love to see you there. Michael and I will be offering some workshops on the workshop day, and there are already a ton of really amazing sessions that have already been proposed, people putting proposals in. So if there's something you'd like to present on, please make sure that you visit that website, connected2024.com, and submit a proposal in there. We would love to see all kinds of different proposals and presentations and things from people around the world and throughout different sectors of the education, EdTech, teaching, learning, training industries. It would be amazing to see some of you there.
Yeah, and the sessions do not have to be LMS centric.
Correct.
It's a very broad educational technology, instructional design approach to learning and collegiality and sharing. So please do consider joining us for that. Speaking of, if you happen to have any ideas for topics or you want to join us as a guest on a future EdTech chat, please just reach out to us via email. We would love to have you on. We would love to take into account some of the ideas that you'd love to hear about, and as we plan out the second half of this year.
Okay. Well, that's it for us this month. Thank you for joining us. We know that August is typically a difficult month for people to carve out time to come join us for this. If you're watching on the recording, we're super glad that you came back around to watch with us. We will see you back here again next month for our next EdTech chat.
All right. Bye, everyone.